Whatever measuring tool you're using for a project, make sure to use it all the way through the project until it's finished. Some of your measuring tapes and other tools can vary up to a 1/16th, maybe even an 1/8 of an inch if they're not very accurate. So whatever you start with, end with that, otherwise you could really mess up a project. Anytime you're going to cut a board and you make a mark, it's a good idea to do a little tick mark or maybe a little check mark and an X. You want to remember exactly which side you're going to keep and which side you're going to throw away, because it's easy to forget when you're moving it around. Whenever we're taking a piece of wood over to a saw to cut, we always have to remember the thickness of the blade. Usually it's around an 1/8 of an inch, so if you don't take in consideration and you cut right on top of that line, you're going to actually be a little short on your piece of wood. So make sure to move it to the left or to the right, depending on which side you're keeping, and always take into consideration the thickness of the blade. Anytime you're working on your project, it's very important to remember to pace yourself. Take your time. Some of the projects that you see on YouTube and other videos where you see these woodworkers go in and they build something in a matter of minutes can actually take a lot longer, especially if you're a beginner at it. So something like this bandsaw box that would normally take some of the pros just a few minutes to put together would actually take some of us, including myself, a lot longer. So pace yourself, work at your own pace, and don't get hurt. Now, anytime you need to drill a hole with a drill bit, sometimes the drill bit is going to want to walk around before the hole actually starts. And if you're trying to make an exact hole, then I'd suggest buying or making yourself what they call an awl. This right here is basically just a pointy piece of metal that'll allow you to go in and get that same exact spot right in the middle, make a little divot, and that way when you start it with your drill bit, it'll want to follow that divot and give you that exact spot. Now this next one is an oldie but a goodie. Anytime you go to drill out a hole with the drill bit, it's sometimes hard to tell exactly how deep you're going to go. So in those cases, measure out exactly how deep you want your hole, put some blue painter's tape on there, and that way you won't over drill. Now anytime you're thinking about buying a new tool, especially if it's an expensive one, I strongly recommend taking a class or a course showing you exactly how to use it. For example, before I bought this bandsaw, I actually took a class and showed me how to make a bandsaw box. I learned a bunch from the instructor, and he was there to show me exactly what I was doing wrong and how to correct it. So if you can afford it, try and take some classes. Now this next one I am totally guilty of. When I first started woodworking is I ran out and grabbed a bunch of cheap screws. They're just drywall screws. These are horrible for woodworking. Usually they're really thin and narrow and are easy to break the head off, and now you have whatever's left is stuck in your wood, and they're a big pain to get out. I'd strongly recommend, if you're going to use screws, to get some construction type screws, and those should help a lot better holding together and less likely to snap off the heads. Now if you're going to use pocket holes, definitely get the appropriate pocket hole screws. Do not use drywall screws for that. The only use for drywall screws is for drywall. Now if you ask a bunch of woodworkers what's one of the most important things to do when you're starting a project, a lot of them would tell you to make a plan. Now of course you don't have to make a fancy one like this. In fact, you could even order some online. In any case, you need to have something written out or drawn out so you know what the measurements are going to be and the angles you need to cut and so forth to make sure that your project will be completed correctly. Because I guarantee you, if you don't have a plan and you run out in your shop and you just start making cuts, it won't look nearly as nice. If by chance you need to make repeated cuts of the same length of a piece of wood, instead of going in and measuring out each piece and then making your cut, you need to set up a stop block. Basically, you need to find the exact length of the wood, set everything up, and put a stop block here, and this allows you to make a cut, slide it in again, make a cut, slide it in again, and you can do that over and over again real quick. Now anytime you're buying lumber at your home improvement store, specifically if you need a really tight square edge, it's a good idea to double check the factory cuts, because in many cases they're not going to be square. In this case, it's almost dead on. But in many cases, this right here will actually be a few degrees off, and thus throwing your angle of whatever you're making a little bit off as well. Anytime you store wood in your workshop, just keep in mind, as temperature changes and humidity changes, the wood is going to change as well. So if you're going to work with a piece of wood and try and make it really flat, and then you're going to actually leave it in your shop for a couple of days, when you come back, there's a good chance it may have slightly warped or just changed shape in general. So go back, double check all your measurements, because if you're not going to put it together in one day, there's a very good chance it might cause a little bit of an irritation when you're trying to put it together later. Anytime you're trying to connect two pieces of wood together, especially if it's side grain to end grain here, it's a good idea to avoid just using glue. You want something in addition to that. So in my case, I would maybe use some pocket screws or some other type of joinery to make sure those stay together. Otherwise, over time, these could separate. If you're just starting out woodworking and you head over to your local home improvement store, when you're looking at the 2x4s, please remember that when it says 2x4s, it's not a 2x4 dimension. It's actually 1.5 by 3.5. Now there's a whole history lesson exactly why this is the case, but just remember that when it's a 2x4, it's a little bit smaller. Now, if you're dealing with hardwoods, there's a very good chance that when they say it's 2 inches and 4 inches, it will be 2 inches and 4 inches. But in either case, take a measuring tape with you so you know exactly what you're looking at. Now, anytime you buy any type of squares or any tools to make sure that your projects are nice and straight, you need to recalibrate these and make sure they are correct. I don't care if they're the cheap version or the high top end stuff. In the process of them getting from the factory to your hands, there's a very good chance they were knocked out of position, and you need to make sure these are square so that your projects will end up as square as well. Now over time, your workshop is going to continue to grow. And if you have a small shop like I do, I highly recommend putting all of your tools and your cabinets and your workbenches on some type of a rolling system or casters. For example, I currently have 3 tools set right here in this corner. In this current position, they're not usable. But because I have them on casters, I can easily move them into an area that I can easily work with them, or just get to the one behind it. So I highly recommend put them on some type of a rolling system. Now, anytime you're about to build a project, I strongly recommend you going out and actually purchasing the wood. Get your hands on it so you know exactly what you're purchasing. Because I guarantee you that if you have some delivered, they're not going to pay nearly as much attention to the quality of the wood. Jigs are very important whenever you're making repeated cuts, and I strongly suggest making any jigs that you can use over and over again. For example, this right here is super simplistic, but it's a jig. I just recently built a ladder for my back building here, and I needed exactly 15 degrees all along the side rails. Well, instead of me measuring over and over and over again, had a line, go up, had a line, and go up. In fact, this right here actually saved me because I goofed up a little bit on the lines, and I was able to go back and repeat those exactly where I needed them without having to remeasure several times. So remember, jigs are important and they don't have to be super fancy. There's a big debate in the woodworking world of what do you do first, collect tools or build yourself a workbench? Now, I would suggest holding off on your workbench just for a little while and start using tools to build projects. The reason why is you'll quickly learn exactly what kind of accessories you would like on your workbench, so when you do build it, you can incorporate that into it. Now, if you need a temporary workbench, I'd suggest going out and building yourself just a couple sawhorses. Then you could just put a piece of plywood or some MDF on top of it and use that as your workbench. Anytime you're making 2 of the same exact piece, if you can, try and make it extra wide and then just cut it in half on the table saw. This will allow you to have 2 pieces that are exactly the same, and you don't have to worry about them being a little bit off if you make them separate. I sometimes still forget this. In fact, when I was making this project, I was reminded, hey, why didn't you just make it extra wide? So don't forget that. Now, if you're planning on staining your project or just even adding a finish to it, I highly recommend going and get some of the scrap leftovers so that you can test out the stain you're thinking about. Because I guarantee you, some of these colors will look completely different on different types of wood. So test it out so you don't regret it later. So what's more important, buying some bunch of tools at the low end price and just have them break occasionally, or saving up and waiting a long time to buy the high end tools? I actually believe there is a middle ground for that. When you're first starting out, especially if you don't have a lot of spare money to spend, I recommend buying some of the more basic lower end tools, because this is something you're just going to be using on occasion. Now, if you start using these on a regular basis and you figure out exactly what you want to do and you really love woodworking, then I'd suggest start to save up for the higher end tools. For example, I have a high-end table saw, I have a high-end bandsaw and drum sander because I knew I was going to be woodworking for a long time. But I also have a combination of some of the lower tools that I started out with. So just keep in mind that you don't have to initially buy top-end tools, but if you're going to be doing this for a long time and you know you like woodworking, I definitely suggest saving up for them. Now, when you're starting off your workshop, it's very important to remember you need to keep any of your tools with your tool accessories. For example, right here is my lathe, and right above it I have some of the tools for carving. Now, if I had this on a different wall in my shop or in a drawer somewhere, it'd be challenging because I'd have to run around and grab stuff, wasting time, potentially falling over or getting hurt with one of the tools. But as long as it's within arm's reach, I can grab it, use it, put it back, and use something else. Remember, tool organization is very important. One of the things I highly recommend in a workshop is good quality lighting so you can see everything that's going on in a shop. That way it's less likely for you to make mistakes or even get injuries. Plus, it'll give you a chance to see the true color of your wood and any stains you might be applying. So make sure you get some good quality lights. And of course, a woodworking video isn't complete unless I mention safety equipment, which is eye protection, ear protection, and some dust collection equipment. If you don't by chance have dust collection, make sure you get an appropriate mask that you can wear whenever you're working in your shop so you don't breathe in all those small particles.